A struggling homesteader saved a Comanche girl from wolves. 15 years later, she returned as war chief, and what she offered him would shake the entire territory. The riders appeared at dawn like shadows given form, moving with the precision of a hunting party. Isaiah Blackwood watched from his cracked window as 6 Comanche warriors approached his failing homestead, carrying no visible weapons, yet radiating controlled danger. The lead rider dismounted and placed something small on his weathered fence post, an object that made Isaiah's work-hardened hands tremble when he recognized it. A child's beaded bracelet, torn and stained with 15-year-old blood. Isaiah hadn't thought about that bracelet in years. He'd assumed it was lost, forgotten, buried under the weight of harder memories. But someone else had kept it all this time, preserved it, cherished it like a sacred relic. But before we go deeper into what happened next, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Texas? Oklahoma? Maybe somewhere far from the frontier? We love hearing from listeners around the world, so drop a comment and let's connect. Now, back to that bracelet. The Comanche woman who stepped forward moved like smoke, fluid, deliberate, impossible to predict. Her eyes held the kind of authority that comes from leading thousands through impossible choices. "You don't remember me," she said, her voice carrying the weight of command. "But I remember the wolves. I remember everything about that night." Isaiah's breath caught in his chest. The wolves, the blizzard, the night that had haunted his dreams for 15 years, the night he'd thought no one would ever know about. She stepped closer, and in the harsh morning light, he could see 3 pale scars on her left wrist. Scars he had bandaged with strips torn from his own shirt, while a dying child bled in his arms. But this wasn't a child anymore. This was someone who could make the earth itself bend to her will. "My name is Takala," she said, and the way she spoke made it sound like a judgment being rendered. "I am war chief of the Red River Comanche, and I have come to settle a debt that has waited 15 years to be paid." But the debt she spoke of wasn't what Isaiah expected, and what she was about to offer him would change everything he thought he understood about justice, memory, and the price of being forgotten. Wait, because what she revealed next would turn his entire world upside down. The bracelet felt impossibly heavy in Isaiah's calloused palm. He turned it over slowly, studying the intricate beadwork that someone had painstakingly repaired over the years. The glass beads caught the sunlight, throwing tiny rainbows across his weathered skin. "You were bleeding so much," he said quietly, his voice rough as gravel. "I thought you'd die before I could get you back to my cabin." Takala stood perfectly still, her dark eyes never leaving his face. The 5 warriors behind her remained mounted, silent as carved stone, but Isaiah could feel their attention like heat radiating from a forge. "I was 9 years old," Takala said. "My father had taken me to gather winter herbs near the frozen creek. We didn't know the wolf pack had been driven down from the high country by early snows." Her voice carried no emotion, but her fingers unconsciously traced those 3 white scars. "4 of them cornered me against the rocks. My father was hunting 100 yards away. He heard my screams but couldn't reach me in time." Isaiah remembered the sound of snapping jaws, the way the pack leader had lunged for the child's throat. He'd fired his rifle twice, maybe 3 times. The details had blurred together over the years, but he remembered the weight of the girl as he'd carried her 7 miles through waist-deep snow. Remembered how her blood had soaked through his shirt, freezing against his skin. "You never came back for the bracelet," he said. "I waited. Thought maybe your people would want to thank me." or at least let me know you'd survived. My father forbade it. Takala's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said owing a debt to a white man would bring shame to our family, that accepting help from our enemies made us weak. Something cold settled in Isaiah's stomach. And now? Now I am war chief. Her voice carried edges sharp enough to draw blood. I answer to no one, not even the memory of a father whose pride nearly cost him his daughter. The word hung in the air between them. War chief. Out here, that title carried power that could reshape entire territories. A Comanche war chief could negotiate with governors, sign treaties affecting thousands of lives, or unleash violence that would echo for generations. Why now? Isaiah asked. Why after all these years? Takala's eyes swept across his sagging fence, his drought-killed fields, the cabin roof that leaked in 4 places. She took in every detail of his poverty, every sign of his isolation and failure. When she looked back at him, something dangerous flickered in her expression. Because I heard what they're planning to do to you, Isaiah Blackwood, and I won't allow it. But before she could explain, the thunder of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Isaiah turned toward the main road and felt ice flood his veins. 6 riders were coming fast, and he recognized the lead horse immediately. It belonged to Marshal Fletcher Kane, and he wasn't coming alone. Here's where everything Isaiah thought he knew about his life started to crumble. Marshal Kane rode like a man delivering a death sentence, his badge catching morning sun as he reined in 20 feet from Isaiah's porch. The 5 men behind him weren't lawmen. Isaiah recognized them instantly. Leonard Graves from the land office, Silas Merchant, who held deeds to half the county, and 3 hired guns whose only job was making sure difficult conversations stayed civil. Blackwood, Kane called out, his eyes sweeping nervously over the Comanche warriors. Didn't expect to find you entertaining guests this early. Isaiah stepped forward, positioning himself between the marshal and Takala. What do you want, Kane? Same thing I wanted last month, and the month before that. Kane dismounted slowly, hand resting casually near his holster. Mr. Merchant's been patient, but patience doesn't pay interest on overdue loans. Silas Merchant urged his horse forward, a thin man with predator's eyes that never stopped calculating. 4 months overdue, Blackwood. 4 months of excuses and empty promises. He pulled a folded document from his coat. This is a writ of seizure. Everything you own becomes property of Merchant Holdings as of sunrise today. The words hit Isaiah like physical blows. 4 months since the drought had killed his cattle. 4 months since the bank had called in his loans. 4 months watching his neighbors cross the street to avoid him because failure was contagious. Give me 2 more weeks, Isaiah said, hating the desperation in his voice. I've got a buyer coming from Fort Worth. He's interested in... No more weeks. Merchant's voice could have frozen water in July. No more buyers. You're finished, Blackwood. Pack what you can carry and get off my land by noon. Takala moved then, just a single step forward, but the effect was electric. The Comanche warriors behind her shifted almost imperceptibly, and suddenly the morning felt charged with violence waiting to be born. Marshal Kane's hand dropped to his gun grip. Ma'am, I don't know what business you think you have here, but this is a legal matter between white men. Indian affairs don't... My business, Takala interrupted, her voice cutting like a freshly stropped blade, is whatever I decide it is. She walked to her horse and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. When she turned back to Merchant, her expression could have carved granite. "How much does he owe?" Merchant licked his lips nervously. $1,200 plus accumulated interest. But that doesn't change the fact that the contract's been breached. The land is legally forfeit. Takala opened the pouch and counted out gold pieces. Real gold, not paper promises. Each coin gleamed in the sunlight like a small sun. The kind of wealth that could buy silence, loyalty, or a man's entire future. But when she finished counting, Isaiah realized the gold wasn't meant for Merchant at all. It was meant for something far more dangerous. But you won't believe what Takala did next. It was something that would change territorial law forever. Takala walked to Isaiah's broken fence and drove a wooden stake into the ground with 3 decisive strikes. Then she tied a strip of crimson cloth to the post, the fabric snapping in the wind like a battle standard. "This land is now under the protection of the Red River Comanche," she announced, her voice carrying across the valley with the force of absolute authority. "Any man who trespasses here answers to me personally." Merchant's face went from pale to crimson. "You can't just claim white man's property. There are laws, treaties legal." "The Treaty of Medicine Lodge," Takala interrupted calmly. Article 9, Section 5. Comanche tribes retain the right to grant sanctuary to any person who has provided significant aid to tribal members. She pulled a rolled document from her saddlebag, official seals gleaming in the sunlight. "I have federal authority to extend tribal protection to this property and its owner. This document is signed by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs himself." Marshal Kane examined the papers with shaking hands, and Isaiah watched the man's face drain of color as he read. Treaties weren't suggestions out here. They were binding federal law backed by military authority. Violating one could bring down the territorial governor, end careers, maybe start wars. "This is absurd," Merchant sputtered. "What aid? When did this worthless homesteader ever help your people?" Takala untied a leather cord from around her neck, revealing a small carved wolf fang. 15 years ago, Isaiah Blackwood saved my life. He fought 4 wolves with nothing but an old rifle and his bare hands. He carried me 7 miles through a blizzard to tend my wounds. She held up her scarred wrist. "These marks are my proof. Federal law recognizes life debts as legitimate grounds for tribal sanctuary." "A child's story," Merchant scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "You expect us to believe—" "I expect you to believe federal law." Takala mounted her horse in one fluid motion. "Mr. Blackwood's debt is hereby assumed by the Red River Comanche. We will settle his accounts in our own time, according to our own customs." The threat was subtle, but devastating. Dealing with a broke homesteader was one thing. Dealing with a Comanche war chief who controlled trade routes and had the ear of federal Indian agents was entirely different. "This isn't over," Merchant muttered, yanking his horse around, but his hired guns were already backing away, clearly wanting no part of a fight with Comanche warriors. As they rode away, Isaiah felt the ground shifting beneath everything he thought he knew about his life. But Takala wasn't finished. She dismounted and walked to his cabin door, her expression suddenly vulnerable in a way that made her seem young again. "There's something else, Isaiah. Something I've never told anyone." She touched the wolf fang pendant. "The night you saved me, you weren't alone in those woods." Isaiah's hand froze on the cabin door. "What do you mean?" "My brother was with me that night." Takala's voice went hollow, Nashoba. He was 11 years old, brave and foolish in equal measure. The wolves got him first. The words hit Isaiah like a fist to the gut. He sank onto his porch steps as memories crashed back. There had been 2 children. How could he have forgotten? The boy had already been dead when Isaiah arrived, his small body torn apart in the snow. Isaiah had focused on saving the girl, on saving who could still be saved. "I tried to fight them off him," Takala continued, her voice steady but empty. "That's when they turned on me. By the time you arrived with your rifle, Neshoba was beyond any help." "I'm sorry," Isaiah whispered. "I should have been faster. Should have." "You saved 1 child when most men would have walked away from the screaming." Takala sat beside him. Most would have decided it wasn't their problem, wasn't their fight. As the sun climbed higher, Takala explained what she'd learned. How Merchant had been systematically destroying small homesteaders across 3 counties, buying up land cheap for the coming railroad. How Isaiah's property sat on the old Comanche winter trail, making it legally protected under federal treaty. How Merchant thought, if he controlled the land, before anyone realized its significance, he could sell it to the railroad for 10 times what he'd paid. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Isaiah asked. "Because knowledge without power is just pain," Takala replied. "But now you have power. My protection, federal law, and something Merchant doesn't expect." "What's that?" Before she could answer, hoofbeats echoed from the main road. But these weren't Merchant's nervous clattering or the marshal's heavy horses. These were cavalry. 2 full companies, nearly 70 soldiers, riding in formation with the blue uniforms of the United States Army. And leading them was Colonel Marcus Brennan, whose reputation for crushing Indian resistance was known across 5 territories. The showdown that would determine Isaiah's fate and possibly ignite a war was about to begin.